I'm gonna call on Eddie to do the introduction, if you will.
Sounds like a plan, Walter.
All right.
What socks are you wearing tonight, Councilman?
Black socks, but I am the Great Pumpkin. And happy Halloween for those of you who are getting prepared to celebrate that holiday.
So it doesn't represent Tennessee football right now.
Roll Tide. But on this day in 1879, anybody got any idea what happened?
Walter's birthday.
No, that's not my birthday. That was
Something to do with the light bulb.
Who wrote the book?
You are a smart guy. It has something to do with the light bulb. Edison, after 14 months of practicing with his light bulb, on this day in 1879, introduced it to the public. And he thought that it might compete with the gas lamp. And it did pretty well. On this day in 1961, Bob Dylan recorded his first album. Recorded it in one day for the cost of $400. And from there he went on and had a little success in the music industry.
You can hear
But they appreciate y'all coming out tonight. As Walter said, I know the weather's kind of nasty outside, but I guarantee you're going to get your money's worth with Gib tonight. Gib's a friend of mine. I've got a story about him that he gave me to read, and it's like 40 minutes long, and I thought, well, that won't do much good, because by the time I get done reading, we'll be out of time. So I won't. But Gib came to us from, let's see, Pipestone, Minnesota. Is that correct?
Correct.
Pipestone, Minnesota. People ask me why Murfreesboro is growing so much now. I say, have you ever been to Pipestone, Minnesota in January? That's why they're coming here, Pipestone, Minnesota. But I'm sure Gib's going to tell you the whole story of where he came from. He's very well educated. He's a phenomenal speaker, a good friend of mine. We have choir practice together every Wednesday night. And I listen to him, and he often gives me advice. And just a few weeks ago, he said, Eddie, you really need to vote for this tax increase. Thanks, Gib. Good advice. But here and there, please welcome Gib Backlund.
So Eddie asked me to speak, and I asked him, what do I talk about and how long? And he said, well, you need to talk for an hour. And I can see that the Historical Society is a lot like church. Everyone sits in the back. And or maybe church is a lot like the Historical Society, I'm not sure. And Eddie is correct. I give him advice every week. And I'm grateful that he took my advice on the tax increase, and I think you should all appreciate what he has helped the city of Murfreesboro do. And if we'll talk more about taxes if you like. I'm happy to do
Go
that.
back to the original story.
So, I had a college professor talking about a character in a novel one time. I majored in English and humanities in college, and then went to MTSU graduate school in history. And anyway, this character in a novel says, take my advice, to another character, and the professor says, you know what it means when someone says, take my advice, what it really means is, be more like me. And so that's, when I give Eddie advice, I'm really telling him he should be more like me. He'd be a better person. And the city would be better off as well. So, a couple of weeks ago,
Riding the Shetland pony guy.
I'm a member of the Murfreesboro Rotary Club, and we have a few folks here from that club. And just a few weeks ago, we celebrated our 100th anniversary, and Greg Tucker was the guest speaker. And he did something that I thought that I liked pretty well. He sort of put the whole Murfreesboro Rotary Club in context. 1919 is when it was established, and so he talked a little about the other things that had happened in that year. And I didn't do exactly that, but with this talk about the battlefield, but I studied at MTSU was the history of tourism, the Cold War, and conservation, national park history, so all of those kinds of things. And so what I did was I put it all together and how the national parks and how Stones River reflect the values of patriotism that were prevalent during the Cold War in the United States. And so that's something that really interests me. And looking at the audience here, looks like quite a lot of you probably remember Eisenhower's State of the Union address from January 1956. I'd say many of you were around at that time, right?
No. Russell wasn't.
There are some people in here who may remember it.
Look at Dr. Talbot shaking his head.
Do you remember, Dr. Talbot? And in 1956, we were in the thick of the Cold War, and you may or may not remember what the U.S. population was back then, but in 1950, we were at 160 million roughly. So today we have twice as many people living in the country as were in 1950. In his speech in 1956, he talked about, and it's really quite amazing to go back and read these things, and nowadays with the internet you can do this with all of the State of the Union addresses, but most of the first half of it, or even more than the first half, was about countering the Soviet threat, about nuclear weapons, about militarization, about civil defense, all of these kinds of things, before he ever even got into ideas about the economy or anything else. But he did talk about the national parks in 1956. That's something that rarely happens. Presidents almost never talk about national parks in their State of the Union addresses. But he said he proposed a program to improve national parks in his State of the Union in 56. And then a couple of paragraphs later, he talked about another major event in American history that was initiated in 1956. Anybody have any ideas what started in 56? Several of you do. Interstate highway system, correct. And it was in a paragraph following the paragraph about national parks, which struck me. But then I realized that he had actually brought up the interstate highway system in 1955, and it had not got funded, and so he was bringing it back up again in 56. In following the end of World War II, of course we dropped the atom bomb on Japan twice, and then the Soviets were gathering information and creating their own atom bomb. We had a diplomat in the United States named George Kennan. Anybody know that name? George Kennan was a scholar and diplomat, and he posed the idea that we contain the Soviet threat, develop a policy of containment to contain them, and that involved us building nuclear weapons and placing them around the country. But containment has a much broader sense as well, and I think that permeated our culture in the 1950s and 60s. We wanted to maintain security, and many of you probably remember one of my first memories of a color photograph in the newspaper was from the early 60s. Growing up in Minnesota, right 200 miles from Omaha and Lincoln, Nebraska, Omaha was a strategic air command, and North Dakota is just up the road a little ways. There was the DEW line across Canada, which was radar stations to monitor the flights over the North Pole, and then also the missile silos all across the northern plains. And so we were very conscious of that nuclear threat. And I remember a color photograph. Of course, memory is faulty, and so maybe I don't remember it, but I think I do. A photograph of a missile silo in the front page of the Minneapolis Star. And some of you probably remember bomb shelter or air raid drills in school. Duck and cover. Anybody here do that? See, I guess we did it, but I can't remember. I do remember getting in line and getting a polio shot in 1957, but I can't remember
53.
the pardon?
53.
Well, you got, 53 was when it was created, but we weren't getting shots then. You were,
Polio pioneers.
Yeah.
yeah, you might have been. John wants to argue with me about everything. You know John Calfee? He's in Rotary also, so we have vigorous debates on a regular basis. But, so, by the way, feel free to interrupt me at any time as he does.
Okay.
It doesn't bother me, and I'm happy to try to address it. He might throw me off track, but Frank's over here, he's recording, and so he may help me rewind and start over. But George Kennan helped develop that policy containment, and that became our world in the 1950s. 1950s was also the world, as Eddie left out of my introduction that I gave him, was later in 1956 is when the 57 Chevy was introduced, which is probably as important as the interstate highway system or the national park system. And the 55, I believe, was the Thunderbird, correct? First Thunderbird, and then in 63 and a half was the Corvette was in 50s. But in 63 and a half, or was 64 and a half the Mustang? 64 and a half. And so, I grew up in the era of muscle cars and highways, and so that seemed to be more important in many ways than atomic bombs. But the highway system grew forth, and you know about the origin of the interstate highway system. Eisenhower had the idea from Germany, is my understanding, and the intent was it was a military highway system. We wanted to have highways to transport military equipment. And there's apocryphal stories that even say that the interstate highway systems also doubled as airstrips, and that the Air Force practiced landing B-52s on interstate highway stretches. The height of bridges over interstates is at a prescribed height in order to permit the passage of military vehicles with trailers transporting military equipment. And I've heard that the landing strip story debunked. I don't know what's really true, but I've read it in a number of places that it was the case, and I just don't know. Anybody here ever see that happen? See a B-52 land on the interstate? Doozer, Chris, you must have.
No, I mean, I know they
You never
do
did?
it in Sweden, and I think the Swiss do it.
Is that right?
Maybe for fighter jets. But
Yeah, so if our airstrips or
Autobahn was designed for that.
yeah, Autobahn was for airplanes as well.
Yeah.
So, in 1951, Conrad Worth became the director of the National Park Service, and following World War II, we had the GI Bill and all kinds of laws that were passed to help move the soldiers back into civilian life, build houses, build refrigerators, build cars. Many people came back into the workforce, and many people were forced out. Many women were forced out of the workforce in the early 50s. But during the war, we didn't manufacture cars in Detroit. We made tanks and airplanes and military vehicles. And so following the war, the demand for cars just skyrocketed, and people were taking vacations, family vacations. In the 1950s, I believe, the average 62% of American families took vacations that lasted 10 days or more. And nowadays, people take, weekends, 3-day vacations, right? But, and they were traveling, people were traveling all around the country, and some of the places they went were national parks, because national parks help support their image of the nation, and help support patriotism, and help create an idea of nation state for the people. But the problem was that during the war, all of the parks were not maintained. Everything had fallen in disrepair, and then the influx of visitors after the war was so great that the parks and the infrastructure in parks could not handle it. If you were in Murfreesboro in 1960, you remember that Stones River National Battlefield did not have a visitor center, didn't have a tour road. There was no movie, there was an entrance to the park and a road that went through it. It was a road that entered on Old Nashville Highway and looped around and came out on Van Cleve Lane. And that was it. There were some metal War Department markers around the battlefield that actually told the story of the battle about locations that were outside the boundary of the park, because the battle was fought over nearly 4,000 acres, but the park was only 350 acres. Most of you know that the battlefield, the fighting occurred all the way from Riverbend neighborhood on the north, all the way down to the Kroger on Cason Lane. And is it Old Fort Parkway over there, Highway 96? And there used to be a historical marker over there, a Tennessee State historical marker, and I think during the widening of the road, it was displaced. I don't know if it's been returned, and I don't know whose yard it's in, but it's probably around somewhere. And so the battle was a huge battle, but very little of it had been preserved. I'm talking about Conrad Worth. As the director of the Park Service, he got intimately involved in the creation of Stones River's Visitor Center and Tour Road, and actually got involved in the discussions about the shape and direction of the tour road. But he had an interesting background, and you can tell he's a smart guy because he grew up in Minnesota, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. His father was a Swiss immigrant, had come to the United States in the 1870s or 80s, I believe, and went to work as a tree trimmer in Central Park. So Theodore Worth from Central Park went to Hartford, Connecticut, and became the superintendent of the Hartford, Connecticut City Park System, and actually established one of the first professional organizations for park managers in the country, and did a very good job in Hartford, and in 1904 moved to Minneapolis, where he became the superintendent of the Minneapolis Park System. And I've often told Eddie that he should visit Minneapolis and see how a park system should really be set up. But that's a bit of advice he has not yet taken. We will talk more about it. I'll buy him a plane ticket.
I never leave city limits, so.
But Theodore Worth's goal in the Minneapolis park system, and he was successful in achieving it over a 20-year period, was to have a playground within a quarter mile of every child in the city, and a recreation center within a half mile of every citizen. And so they developed really a tremendous city park system. And Conrad Worth grew up there and saw this in operation. He later went to landscape architecture school. And in 1931, Conrad Worth went to work for the National Park Service and was the assistant director for lands. And Dr. Tulber, you remember the election of 1932? The presidential election of 1932, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president. And when was he inaugurated?
March
1933, what day?
March 4th.
March 4th. When did that change?
Then.
That was the last March 4th inauguration. So March 4th, Franklin Roosevelt became president, and within a month had gotten a flurry of alphabet soup bills passed through Congress and signed, including the bill that created the Civilian Conservation Corps. And by June 1933, Conrad Worth headed up the state park side of the Civilian Conservation Corps. By June of that year, remember, inauguration March 4th. By June, they had 250,000 enrollees in the Civilian Conservation Corps. Do you think that Murfreesboro City can operate that fast today? Probably not. State, U.S. government, not many people can. Unless we're on a war footing, then we might be able to. But it's quite amazing. And so Conrad Worth had a good introduction to how do you put together a giant program in a very short time. And so the CCC went to work in 33 and built structures all over the country. State parks all around here have CCC structures. I worked at Mammoth Cave National Park. We had numerous walls, well houses, stone buildings built by the CCC friend of mine who was the superintendent at Cape Hatteras when I worked there, his dad was in the Army and he headed up one of the CCC camps at Mammoth Cave. And so it's, I worked with a cave guide at Mammoth Cave named Shorty Coates, and he would take us on these cave tours. He'd lead the cave tours, and he would always ask the person in the back, he was an older guy at the time, he'd always ask the person in the back what he majored in, hoping that you would say geology, because he didn't go to college. And he said, I majored in storytelling. And I was a CC boy. He helped build the trails in Mammoth Cave, and so that was quite an education. The cave also had a aspect to the Cold War story, because when I went to work there, 1978, we worked out of the ranger station, was called the fire hall. We had a fire truck and an office there, and we had 5-gallon tins of hard candy, red and yellow hard candy. Anybody ever seen those? 5-gallon tins that were Cold War supplies that had been placed in the cave in the 1960s when the cave was set up as a bomb shelter. And so many of the national park sites hosted bomb shelters and had litters and blankets and 5-gallon tins of red and yellow hard candy. And so we were eating hard candy in the late 70s that had been bomb shelter supplies that did not work out as a bomb shelter. But anyway.
It was tuberculosis place too.
Yeah, the cave was a TB hospital in the 1800s. So I was talking about Theodore Worth, who was the Minneapolis Park System head and had worked in Central Park. And Central Park is a part of the Stones River story and the National Park story as well. Because in the early 1800s, there were no city parks. There was no such thing. That idea had not been thought of quite yet. As the country industrialized in the 1820s and 30s and 40s and 50s, cities became more and more kind of raunchy places, full of horses and manure and no plumbing and chamber pots, and you dump your waste wherever you can, and the streets were not clean. And so in the 1820s and 30s, wealthy people began to visit cemeteries, because cemeteries were neat and clean and taken care of. And the big cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, all had very beautiful cemeteries, either in the city or on their outskirts. And Andrew Jackson Downing, who was the editor of Horticulture magazine in the 1840s, noticed this, and he thought, that's a good idea. We could have landscaped areas set aside as parks. And so in his magazine, he advocated for the creation of a park, Central Park in New York City. And the city fathers adopted that idea, and they held a contest to design Central Park. And many of you have heard of Frederick Law Olmstead. Frederick Law Olmstead and another guy named Calvert Vaux had the winning proposal. And so in 1855 or so, Downing was dead. He died in a steamboat accident in 1852, so he never got to see his idea come to fruition. But Olmstead and Vaux won the contest 1855, I believe, it might have been 56, 7. And by the 1870s, New York Central Park had been established. You see the news today about Central Park? You're gonna have a couple of new monuments. Actually, some of the land was taken from people who lived there, and the story today wasn't about it, but they are going to build a monument to women who were involved in the city and in the park somehow. So that will be the first monument to women in Central Park. Anybody been in Central Park here? It's really quite amazing. I liken Stones River to Central Park because Stones River battlefield is a great big green space in a rapidly developing area. It's not exactly the same, but Central Park I think is 800 some odd acres. Stones River battlefield is 650, hopefully soon 700. But so it's very similar size. But Central Park is really quite an amazing space, and it's very carefully designed. Olmstead designed the park to and many people now think of Olmstead Landscapes as nature. We've come to think of what he has done. Biltmore Mansion, anybody been Biltmore in Asheville? That's a Frederick Law Olmstead landscape. Buffalo, New York has an Olmstead Park. Memphis has Olmstead landscapes. They're all over the country. And they're really quite amazing. And so they seem almost natural, but they're really highly manicured and managed spaces. But his idea was that they would be democratic places. They would allow all people to benefit from the virtues of green space and parkland and have a better life for it. So later on, his son was instrumental also in the national parks because he helped write the legislation that created the National Park Service. So Olmstead is tied to us here at Stones River as well as Central Park is. And but that came about, and then gradually we'd set aside in this country some other spaces, patriotic spaces. Statue of Liberty was complete. Anybody know when? 1880, somewhere in 86, and the Washington Monument around the same time. The Eiffel Tower, same time period. We had ideas. Everybody had ideas at that time to build great big tall buildings. You know, when the Washington Monument was completed, it was the tallest building in the world, 500 feet. Something I just learned recently. But so the parks came about, and Olmstead was back in those days when Downing was writing, the occupation didn't exist. It was not called landscape architect. They were called landscape gardeners, but eventually they became known as landscape architects. Olmstead also wrote a plan for Yosemite in 1864. The U.S. government granted Yosemite Valley to the state of California in 1864 for park purposes. And then Olmstead wrote a document that was an outline of a plan for it. It was never really adopted by the park. It was not a national park, it was a state park at that time. It became a national park later on. I think it was in 1890. Yeah.
Quick question. Did Olmstead put the pathways through the park? Was that part of the original
In
design?
Central Park?
Yes.
That I couldn't tell you.
I was
don't know.
curious because
Yeah. He said asked if Olmstead designed the paths in Central Park. I don't know, but I know that they've had a fundraising effort in recent years to try to restore the original design in the park, because as we all know, trees drop their limbs and then the city has to pick them up. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
ouch.
So, the similar currents going on around the country. 1890, back up a little bit, 1872, Congress voted to create the first national park, Yellowstone National Park, and then parallel current to set aside battlefields in 1890. Chickamauga National Military Park was established, Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. And their idea at the time was to establish battlefields. Think about 1890, the members of Congress, how many do you suppose were Civil War veterans?
Just about all of them.
Just about everybody. How many mayors of towns were Civil War veterans, council members? How many women were in Congress at that time? How many women were mayors of cities? I think you could probably count them on one hand if you were an amputee, and but not much. And so the veterans really held sway in this country, and in 1890 voted to create the first military park. And the idea was to honor each of the major armies, not each battlefield, but just a battlefield that would represent one of the major armies that fought in the Civil War. 1897, a Congressman Richardson from Murfreesboro introduced a bill to establish Stones River National Battlefield, but the objection was that those armies had already been represented at Chickamauga, so, we didn't need Stones River National Battlefield. And then in 1904, Congress decided to have a moratorium on the creation of any new military parks until they could complete a study that would describe the relative importance of each battlefield and create an inventory of each battlefield. And Bill, that could be something related to the document that you might have about battlefields. But that study took a while, and it really lost importance during World War I. People weren't thinking about that during World War I. And in 1925, I believe, somewhere in there, that study was completed, but it put Stones River in the second tier of battlefields, didn't feel it was all that important. Of course, those of us who have worked at Stones River think it's important, and I think a lot of historians of the Civil War now think that the Western Theater was actually more important than the Eastern Theater. This is where the Civil War was won and lost. The drive from Nashville to Murfreesboro to Chattanooga to Atlanta and on to the sea is what really ripped the Confederacy in half and made them unable to continue the fight. And so opinions have changed even since the most recent study, which was done there was a Civil War Site Survey Commission study done in 1988, 89, which sort of updated the earlier study. And as a result of that report, Bart Gordon, congressman at the time, was really quite interested in how that was going to come out. And one of the things it said about Stones River was that essentially that the battlefield is lost. There's nothing left to preserve, and which was not really accurate, because there was a good bit of land still available, and still is, although it's being developed apace, as you might guess. 1916, well, after Yellowstone was created and a number of other national parks were created, there was no National Park Service to manage the parks. The battlefields were managed by the War Department, and Statue of Liberty was War Department, the Washington Monument, Wright Brothers National Memorial, Kitty Hawk. Many, many historic sites were managed by the War Department. In 1916, another piece of the progressive era, the National Park Service was established and signed into law by Woodrow Wilson, and it created an agency that would gather all of the parks, all of the natural parks, under one organization, and so that's when we began to see park rangers in national parks. Stepping back a few years, in 1906, Congress passed a law that Teddy Roosevelt signed it, the Antiquities Act, which was designed to protect archaeological sites and sites of great antiquity in the United States, Native American sites, primarily in the Southwest, because they were being looted rapidly and the sites were being lost, and so that helped protect those. And then it gave the president the power to proclaim national monuments. And the very first one that Roosevelt proclaimed, very first national monument in the country, was Devil's Tower National Monument, right around that time, I'm not sure of the exact year, but Roosevelt was a great advocate for parks, and you may have seen the Ken Burns series on national parks, where it talked about him going off on his own without Secret Service protection on a hike in Yellowstone and going into the wilderness for 2 weeks and all on his own before he came out. Imagine a president going anywhere by himself today. It just doesn't happen. And but Teddy Roosevelt was able to do it and escaped the watchful eye of his protectors. Bumping forward again to 1933 and Franklin Roosevelt, he recognized the value also of the historic sites and the natural areas and the archaeological sites, and he thought it would be a good idea, and people had been lobbying this for some years. The director of the Park Service at the time was a man named Horace Albright, who had come to Washington in 1914 when he was in his early 20s, came from Independence, California, or near Independence, and he he was assigned the job of helping get the National Park Service created. And he and Stephen Mather did so in 14, 15, and 16. Late in the 20s, he became the director following Stephen Mather's illness, and he was able, just by chance, in 1933 in May, Franklin Roosevelt wanted to take a ride out to Shenandoah National Park from Washington. And it's just a couple hours by car. And he asked Horace Albright to ride in the car with him. And so Horace Albright got to bend his ear for the 6 or 8 hours they were in the car and advocated for a reorganization of the government which would bring the historic sites under the aegis of the National Park Service. That was in May. In June, Roosevelt issued an executive order that brought the historic sites into the National Park Service. And then in August, Albright decided he had accomplished all that he could do, and he retired at, I think he was in his late 30s, and maybe even younger than that. And so the Stones River, along with all of the other War Department sites, Chickamauga, Statue of Liberty, Wright Brothers, came under the management of the national parks. Stones River was, at that point, really most well known for being a cemetery. We have the National Cemetery here. I see Shirley Jones is not here. She's still a member?
Yes, sir.
So Shirley used to, when I was working, I came here in '91 to work at the battlefield, and she would often come out and just refer to the battlefield as that Yankee Cemetery. And so that's how I think of the place. It's just a Yankee Cemetery. And but that's what it was known for, and just happened to have a battlefield alongside it. And for many years, it was run by a superintendent who was at Chickamauga, and maybe at Superintendent Natchez Trace was the manager of Stones River Battlefield for some time. But by 1950s, it had its own superintendent, and in 1956, 55, 56, all these newspaper stories, magazine editorials were coming out saying that the national parks were in such terrible shape. All of the growing population, the growing vacationing population of the United States, the growing number of cars, needed national parks to be in good shape. And many of these articles appeared in Reader's Digest, Saturday Evening Post, the Harper's Magazine, Sports Illustrated Travel, and they all decried the condition of national parks. Bernard DeVoto, in one of them, even said, "Let's close," the title of his article was, "Let's close the national parks. They're in such bad shape." So Conrad Worth is the director at this time, and he sees the condition and he hears it. Lawrence Rockefeller was also a great benefactor of parks at the time, and he noticed it, and he wrote a letter. Back then in the 1950s, people wrote letters. He wrote a letter to Eisenhower and asked him to do something. This was 1953. Asked Eisenhower to do something about the condition of national parks. So Eisenhower wrote a letter to his Secretary of Interior. I guess nowadays, I don't know how people communicate, but they wrote letters. And so Eisenhower wrote to the Secretary of Interior, Douglas McKay, this. So McKay was in Eisenhower's office in 2 days after he got the letter. I wonder if it went through the post office or how this letter got delivered. I would love to see the stamp on it. I guess in 53, 54, been a what, 2 cent, 3 cent stamp? First class would have been 3 cents maybe. And so McKay went over and talked to Eisenhower about it, and this is in January 54. In the meantime, Conrad Worth had seen what had happened around the country with dams. That was another topic in Eisenhower's State of the Union addresses. He was talking about water control projects throughout the West. And that was a big emphasis of the federal government, was to build dams for hydropower, flood control, irrigation, all of those kinds of things. So that's the Bureau of Reclamation in the West and the Corps of Engineers in the East. And of course the TVA had already been established, late forties or mid forties, and the Truman wanted to establish the Columbia Valley Authority after Roosevelt's death in the late forties, and wasn't able to get it established because people decried the TVA and the CVA as socialist experiments, and the sentiment was not for spreading socialism in the country in the late forties, you might have guessed. And but nonetheless, the Columbia River did get a power authority, and I can't recall what it's called. Anybody know the Bonneville Power Administration? And that's it. So the series of dams on the Columbia River is comparable to what we have in the east with the Tennessee River, but it wasn't called the authority. And so anyway, Worth had seen this, and he thought, we have to follow the model that's been established by the dam builders. They don't go in and ask for, $100,000 or $1 million. They go in and ask for the whole pie. And as every department does in every government agency and in every corporation, everybody thinks their department is the most important department and they need all of the money. And I would agree that the Park Services does need all that money. But Roosevelt said, let's put a package together. And so beginning in 54, he got early 55, he got a group of people together, a couple of committees, a steering committee, and sent out a series of memos, which are in the files at the battlefield, a series of 8 memos over a period of a couple of years. And each memo requested certain things from every superintendent in the National Park System. And one of them would be, what do you, the first one would be, we're gonna do this. The next one was, what do you need? Send us a list of everything that you need and or want. And the superintendent of Stones River asked for virtually nothing, and that's what he got. He, I guess he was fiscal conservative, I don't know. But he asked for a small piece of land from the cemetery to cross the railroad tracks to the brand new Nashville Highway. Wanted to build a road to make it easier because the new Nashville Highway was in the planning stage and was going to be built. What year was that finished? Who knows? Greg, you got all that one.
56.
New Nashville Highway?
58, I would think.
Was it finished or so? Yeah.
It was earlier than that, it was about 53, I think, 53, 54.
Oh, really? 53?
Out of Smyrna.
Yeah. And so he wanted access to that because that had bypassed the battlefield. And you all remember the old entrance from Van Cleve Lane, from New Nashville Highway on Van Cleve Lane, and how terrible that was.
Oh, yeah.
And watching people sneak around the railroad arms, and in some cases getting run over, and then coming down to the intersection of the old Nashville Highway where we had an accident a week, and before Thompson Lane was built, and Van Cleve Lane was the primary access. But superintendent of the battlefield at the time didn't ask for much, but places like Smokies and Yellowstone, of course, asked for the moon, and got half of the moon anyway. And so when Worth started putting this package together, he got wind that there might be a request for him to come to the president's cabinet meeting. The secretary of the president's cabinet, there was somebody back then who took notes at all those meetings, a guy named Maxwell Rabb, I believe. Rabb had seen the editorial in the Saturday Evening Post that talked about the condition of national parks, and he thought, well, that'd be a good topic for a cabinet meeting. So Worth got word of that in May 1955, and so they started putting together a program to present to the cabinet. Well, the meeting kept getting postponed and postponed. But you can imagine being in that office when you are told, we're gonna have a 10-minute presentation to the president, and we have to get ready and put it together, and they squirmed around and put something together, and they actually created a slide program with a script, and it was very well done, and it took months to get it, in order and put together, and finally, in January '56, 3 weeks after the State of the Union address, Worth goes to, I probably said Albright a minute ago, I meant Worth. Worth goes to the cabinet meeting with the Assistant Secretary of Interior, and they make their 10-minute presentation to Eisenhower and the rest of the cabinet. And Eisenhower says after it, "Why didn't you ask us in 1953? And a month later, appropriated something like $80 million to start improving national parks. The program was to be a 10-year program called Mission 66, which began in 56 and was to continue until 1966. Unfortunately for Worth, in 63, of course 1961, John F. Kennedy became president, and in 63, he had brought in Stuart Udall as Secretary of Interior, and the world had changed early 60s, and Udall had some new ideas. Conrad Worth was in the old world, Udall was in the new world, and brought in George Hartzog to be the director, who actually had worked with Worth previously and thought well of him. Worth thought well of Hartzog, but Worth retired, and Hartzog wasn't really focused on Mission 66, and so it languished. But in the meantime, Worth and his committees, his two committees, had managed to put together packages to create 112 visitor centers in national parks, including the visitor center at Stones River. There was no such thing as a visitor center prior to that. Conrad Worth coined the term visitor center. And so whenever you see such a thing around the country, it came from him. And the idea was, he'd been around in the CCC days when we had a lot of free labor to build log and stone buildings. But he realized in the 1950s and 60s, we couldn't afford to do that anymore. And he embraced what was then modern architecture. And many visitor centers actually received awards from architectural associations. They got written up in the Architectural Digest because they were very creative. And they used modern materials, which we now sort of think is old-fashioned, but mid-century modern is coming back. You gonna time me, Eddie? You told me I had to talk an hour and a half. How much time?
Doing great, doing great.
So, it's like the guy in church looking at his watch. What am I supposed to do?
Pass off and play, let's go.
Wake everybody up.
Demas is closing.
So, now I've lost my train of thought. Visitor center, the battlefield was established by law in 1927, dedicated in 1931 or so, and so it was. But the cemetery was built in 1865.
We've got the oldest monument out there, the Hazen.
The Hazen Monument, one of the oldest monuments. I mean, you start saying you got the oldest something, and somebody's going to do some research and find something that's older than they have.
Right.
So there was a monument at. This is an aside. This is not part of the main talk. So I will continue the main
Count
talk
on your time
shortly.
there.
What's the most interesting thing about the Vista Center for the casual visitor?
I will get to that.
Okay.
In
61.
During the 60s.
Visitor Center was built, it was completed in 64, dedicated in 64, but the oldest monument in the country was 1861, is at Manassas, I believe Manassas First Bull Run. And it was a Confederate monument, but it was dismantled at some point and moved and relocated, whatever. There was a battle in Kentucky, Rowlett Station near Munfordville.
Yeah.
There's a monument there, but it's no longer on the battlefield. It's in Louisville, I believe in one of the cemeteries in Louisville. And there was also a monument in Connecticut, not on a battlefield, but it's in Connecticut. And so when we said we had the oldest Civil War monument in the country,
Oldest monument continuously.
so we have qualified, you know, the characteristic of an intelligent person is that you qualify everything you say. And so we qualify that statement. We say we have the oldest intact monument in its original location from the Civil War, which is the Hazen Monument, built in 1863. So I qualify that 3 times. So that makes me really intelligent.
Which one's, that's older than where the Union are buried, right? I mean, who's buried around?
It's Union soldiers who were members of Hazen's brigade. And if you go up there, you'll notice that some of the stones are very primitive limestone stones, but there are some replacement stones that are the typical military marble headstones. And don't ask me other stuff about it, because I can't remember everything. I mean, people spell names differently, and so we would get questions about, well, my grandfather's name was spelled like that, and it might be now, but back then, who knows, he spelled it that way, and somebody else spelled it this way. So we have 4 spellings of somebody's name, and people want us to change stuff, and, well, which way do you want us to go? But, so the Hazen Monument is, has a larger piece of property surrounding it now because of Bart Gordon's interest in expanding the battlefield after that survey done in the late 80s. But Stones River was is part of the legacy of Conrad Worth efforts to improve the national parks, a result of the patriotic movement following World War II to contain communism, part of the movement to make family life in America, to improve family life in America for those people who are driving, living in the suburbs, traveling around the country. And so ultimately, Stones River, the national parks really do reflect the patriotic values of the country, especially in the 1950s period, the notion of containment and containing communism. And so I'll take any questions that you might have now.
What about metal detecting? Could we,
You know, if you go to metal detect, we're gonna take your car and your metal detector and maybe your house.
but people used to though.
What is the basement of the visitor center?
Oh, okay, so,
What's the significance of that?
that's right. So,
It's a dungeon.
yeah, I wanted to end and make an advertisement right now. I am a member of the Friends of Stones River National Battlefield, and I would like you to be a member as well. A number of you are already, and if you have let your membership lapse, or even if you haven't, I would like you to make an additional contribution. This is a membership application and a bookmark, and this is just a membership application and a brochure, and this is a little card. And so, if you commit, I will answer your questions. I'll put these, yes, we'll pass.
Pass them back.
Only take one if you want one. If you plan, we can't have it if you're not gonna donate.
And they make great bookmarks.
Oh, look,
This one
Hazen's on
says
the
the
front.
bookmark and you turn it in as
If you wanna keep it, you can buy the bookmark from me for $10. Cash or check,
Small bells.
no card. So, the visitor center, actually, this is another story. This is a long story, but,
Short side story.
okay, July 25th, 1961. What's going on in the country?
Well,
Who's president?
Lincoln?
Yeah, 1961.
Oh,
Kennedy.
Oh,
Kennedy.
Cold War story. Okay, what happened? What had just
That's
happened?
the Bay of Pigs.
Clemente hit a home run.
Bay of Pigs. What was Bay of Pigs? Wasn't that October?
That's in Cuba or somewhere.
Well, when was the Berlin crisis?
Yeah.
Oh, that's 48.
Well, this is another one in '60s. Soviets blockaded Berlin,
Yes, again.
right?
Wall.
Berlin Wall got built,
You're right.
and so on July 25th, 1961, Kennedy made a speech that talked about the condition of the country, the fact that we were in this conflict with the Soviets, and he asked for a troop buildup, military arms buildup, and he recommended that people build bomb shelters
That's right.
in order to protect themselves. And at that time, the visitor center at Stones River was in the planning stages, and so the planners added a bomb shelter to the drawings that for the basement. And of course, one thing about bomb shelters and the whole notion of civil defense was that the government had to convince people, if they wanted the people to support this arms buildup, they had to convince people that surviving a nuclear holocaust was possible. And so they created this civil defense agency. Civil defense had been around, it changed names several times, but they created this agency to give out plans for bomb shelters. The Murfreesboro Daily News Journal, I think, mentions that the first bomb shelter was built in Rutherford County in a house somewhere out by Overall Creek in September 1961. So the planners for Stones River added a bomb shelter to the plans for the visitor center. I remember when I was a kid, a friend of mine, parents put a bomb shelter in their basement. They put, you know, cement block. Did you have a bomb shelter in your basement?
No, but I lived in New York, and Governor Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller, encouraged the building of bomb
Yeah.
shelters.
So we all thought, well, we'll go in the bomb shelter, we'll survive, and you come out and the landscape is toast, and you get, you know, fall out and die. And so it was a bad idea, but by convincing you that a bomb shelter would work, we could continue the buildup of arms. But the visitor center's bomb shelter was designed for 100 people, and they had food, 5-gallon tins of hard candy, and blankets, and stretchers, litters, and places, and a shovel and a sledgehammer on the wall, because the concrete walls in the basement are like that. So it's a very solid basement, and you probably would survive the blast in Smyrna, but when you came out, you know, everything was toast, and so it wouldn't have been much fun. But in order to get out, they took a 6-foot culvert and ran it straight down into the ground, and then angled it into the basement wall, and had a 6-foot wide round opening, which they filled in with cinder blocks, and then they filled the culvert with sand, and then landscaped over it. And so when you're in the basement in the bomb shelter, which was designed to have a generator, which would have used air brought in from outside, and the generator was
You're toast again.
the generator was never installed. And so what would happen is if you went down there, the 100 people who were around went into the basement, and you wanted to get out because all of the access to the building was gone, except for the concrete that you were in, you would take the sledgehammer and hit the cinder blocks, and then you would use the shovel to shovel the sand that fell into the room by gravity, and you'd shovel out that passageway, and you would crawl out and see the burned landscape. And this is a picture of the culvert. This was an addition to the drawings because the planning had already been done. Yeah, this is an addition to the architectural drawings for the building. And you'll notice it says, handwritten on the picture, installed per detail. And then note down at the bottom, it says, provide and mount clear floor, a 10-pound sledgehammer, and 2 short-handled shovels.
Kid, did that go through the planning commission?
You know, yeah.
Was the volume of the sand lesser than the volume of the basement?
Yes. The volume of the sand would have been less than the basement, but you probably would have filled a room with it. Got a great sandbox. And you know, when we did the remodeling.
Didn't turn the glass from the glass.
What?
Assuming the sand did not
Turn to glass, yeah.
from the glass.
Any other questions?
When was the visitor center remodeled?
So
And what
the
cost?
original visitor center was completed, dedicated in April 1964, and we reopened after remodeling on August 6th, 2004. So it was in place for 40 years as it was, and that's a long time. Museum exhibits get pretty stale at 40 years, so I was glad. The new ones have held up pretty well, been there 15 years. And the reason I remember the date that we reopened is my birthday.
Who was the first superintendent?
The first superintendent of the cemetery, Shipley was there in the, was he there for a long time? Did you know him?
I knew his children, I went to school with him.
Victor Shipley, and I can't tell you what years, he was one of the superintendents.
Late 40s.
Okay, yeah. he was around a long time. I don't know if he was the very first, because, he might have been, because prior to that, Chickamauga ran the park. Yeah. Any other questions?
About how many visitors does the battlefield see each year?
How many visitors a
I'm
year?
here.
Right now, it's in the neighborhood of, I'm a little out of touch, but, upper 200,000.
I'm hearing 280 a couple of years
Yeah.
ago. Thank you, Pokemon Go.
Okay, yeah, well, actually, when we opened the new entrance on Thompson Lane in 2011, so many people were able to find us, we would always talk to people saying, well, I could see you, from the Thompson Lane Bridge, we could see you there, but we didn't know how to get there. And so when the entrance on Thompson Lane opened, it made a huge difference. I think it jumped by a third.
Well, it opened up new land there, nobody's ever been down to.
Yeah, so you can
GE
see.
property. If y'all vote,
The
you got that
GE
worked
property, you probably heard something about GE, and that is that the American Battlefield Trust has made an offer, and they have just received grant money, I believe. There was a news release, I haven't read it, I just saw the link. They received grant money, and they have a closing date set to purchase 42 acres of what was GE, which is now owned by O'Reilly Auto Parts. Remember, O'Reilly wanted to build a distribution center there. There were a lot of objections because of traffic. And at any rate, so the American Battlefield Trust, formerly the Civil War Trust, approached them, and they agreed to sell it to American Battlefield Trust, which will hold it in hopes that at some point in the future, the National Park Service would have to have a congressional authorization to acquire it. That is a congressional boundary authorization. But in the meantime, some other entity can manage it until that happens. Now, sometimes these things can take a long time, but there are lots of land conservancies around the country that manage land, and cities that manage parks. So I think it would be great if Murfreesboro got into the historic preservation business.
And the subdivision on it.
What about the figurines? Who came up with the idea to put like the little fake cannons?
All around the battlefield?
Yeah.
I think
Last 10 years, probably.
Jim and I.
And who is Jim?
I didn't come up with the idea. I saw it somewhere else, and I said, hey, that might work well. Well, because so we have these weathering steel cannons around the battlefield. They're cheap. You know what a cannon costs? A real live cannon and a carriage? Probably 30 for reproduction. They're $30, $40, $50,000. And these little steel cutouts, they're cheaper.
Were any of those used at any of our cannon there used at the battle?
Well, yeah, at the battlefield, we have, I don't work there anymore, so I don't really speak for them, but I'll speak from faulty memory. I think we have 3 original tubes, maybe 4.
That's cool.
So you go into the visitor center. Isn't there one in the visitor centers?
I think
can't
the
remember.
one given the museum in that,
The ones that are in the building, the original tubes are indoors.
yeah.
Yeah. Some may be in storage, but we moved the original tubes from the battle indoors, and then we have a lot of reproduction tubes. So, they used to be cheaper than they are now, and the carriages out on the field are all metal. They hold up better than wood rots. We used to have some wooden ones, and they just go away on it.
Whose log house was that on Van Cleve? Y'all remember that? The
The
log?
log house, that was Dr. Ray Miller. He was a veterinarian.
Okay.
Yeah, and the boundary expanded in '87, we added 50 acres, and then gradually purchased it, and expanded again in '91 to the authorized boundary. What Congress says we can expand to is about 712 acres. And I think right now the park is 650 plus or minus something. And then with the addition of GE, if that came into the boundary, then the authorized would become 750 out of a 4,000 acre battlefield. So it's still just a fraction. For such an important battle, it's just a tiny fraction. You look at other major battles in the Civil War, Chickamauga, Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg, they got the whole thing. Stones River got shortchanged because of that, it wasn't so important, and but unfortunately that's a hard thing to overcome, but I think gradually historians are recognizing the importance of Stones River. And those of us who work there, of course, think it's the most important.
Yeah.
Time up? Okay.
Just for
for the record, that was Gib that mentioned bombing Smyrna, that was not me. And, I don't wanna be in the News Journal tomorrow. One note I put down here, something about, he was talking about national parks, and I know a lot of y'all have been to Smoky Mountain National Park, where they've got the black bears and stuff. And, I was hearing tonight on the news that, koalas are no longer considered bears.
Poor fellows.
Apparently, they don't qualify. But, anybody know which city has won the municipal parks system for the state of Tennessee for the last 20 consecutive years? That would be Murfreesboro, yes, yes, Murfreesboro has won the park system, the Governor's Cup, for the last 20 years. And to Gib's delight, I'll be coming by your house and just sign the list over here on the table next to Carol, and I'll be picking your limbs up this week. I'll be sure and get by, just names and addresses.
Get in the hook.